Hi, my name is Glenn Morgan. Thank you for watching. This is We the Governed. Today we're going to be discussing write-in political campaigns and why they are the hot topic in Washington State today. All right, we're back in Washington State, and this time we're going to be discussing write-in elections and write-in campaigns. There are two underlying state laws that deal with how these work in Washington State. I encourage you to read these statutes and get more familiar with them if you have a high degree of interest or if you're thinking about being a write-in candidate. I get a lot of questions about this during election season, and so I hope that this video will answer those questions and give you a better sense of why these things work, when they work, and when they don't. And the reason why we're even discussing write-in elections right now is because of a concern that I had in an article I wrote a little while ago about the lieutenant governor race in Washington State. And what my concern was that there were a number of different Republicans who had jumped into this race. There were 4 of them, and they kind of split the vote, and so only 2 Democrats came through in the primary. Washington State has a jungle primary, top 2 system, and Denny Heck and Mark Elias are the 2 who came through, and they'll be the only 2 names on the ballot. So what happened is the Washington State Republicans decided they have nothing left to lose in this race. They don't have a candidate in the race, so they might as well do a write-in campaign. And that's the idea. Let's just jump on in and see what happens. Maybe we can get lucky. And that's kind of the approach that's going on. And because of that, there's been a lot of discussions about write-in campaigns in Washington State. Now, there's a rule in state law, and we call it was kind of nicknamed the sore loser rule. And basically what this means is if you've already run for that position and you lost that race in the primary, you're not allowed to run again, and that's basically the sore loser rule. You're angry you lost, so you want to go and run again in the general as a write-in candidate. You don't get that option in Washington State. That is illegal. Now, that means that the 4 people who jumped into this race and kind of flooded the zone and split the Republican vote amongst themselves, those people are out. They're not going to be running again for lieutenant governor. They could run for as a write-in somewhere else, but they can't run in this race. And so the sore loser rule means that those aren't options. So the question is, who can run as a write-in candidate? And there are 2 names that have come forward. There are actually a number initially, and then they've kind of it's been winnowed down to 2 different names. And one of them is former governor candidate Josh Freed, who lost the governor's race, but he can go ahead and run as a write-in candidate in the lieutenant governor's race. And the other one is former Republican Chair Susan Hutchinson, who's also run for statewide office before. And both of these people have good name recognition. They have the ability probably to raise some more money, and they're credible write-in candidates for this position. And by the time this video comes out, I don't know if they'll have resolved which of them is the one who does the race, but this is the discussion that's going on in Republican circles right now, and we'll see which of them decide to run. Arguably both of them could, but it's probably more realistic that only one of them decides to run. So the one thing to remember about write-in campaigns is they're very, very difficult. Voter apathy is a real thing. I mean, we had this recent election, about 54% of the people voted in the primary election in Washington State, and that's very impressive. It's actually one of the highest voter turnouts in a primary election in Washington State going back to the 90s. However, it's still very difficult, even there, to convince people to vote for you when your name's already on the ballot, let alone when they're confused and busy with life and the kids at home or work or not having work or in this COVID era, all the other drama that seems to come along with that. And so write-in candidate campaigns are difficult because now you got to convince those busy people who have a hard time probably voting or remembering to vote in the first place that they need to take that additional step to write in your name. It's not easy. The other thing is that write-in campaigns are very different. You don't necessarily have to win a majority of the votes, and that's kind of something that's unusual. Washington State's top 2 primary system, when they implemented that, the idea was that there will only be 2 people in the general, and therefore the winner always gets more than 50% of the vote. However, with a write-in kind of option that jumps into that type of a race, now somebody could actually theoretically win that race with just 34% of the vote or more. And since any Republican who puts their name on the ballot and runs for a statewide office, you will get a minimum of 40% of the vote. there's kind of some attraction for the Republicans to think, hey, we'll just put a write-in candidate running for this office and see what actually happens. So you have the ability to win even if you don't get the majority. Now, the other advantage that a write-in campaign would have is that even when you don't win, you have an impact on the outcome. Right now, there's 2 Democrats running for this seat, and so the Republicans feel like, hey, we can make an impact. Maybe we can prevent Denny Heck from getting through, or we can prevent Mark Elias from getting through, whatever the goals might be. By having a write-in campaign, that changes the math, it changes the outcome of that election. So it's kind of what makes them very different in this case. Now, I know what you're thinking. Does anybody ever actually win write-in campaigns? And that's a great question, but in some cases they do. It's not common. Most of the time it's kind of a steep road to climb. It's very difficult, but sometimes they do. And let's talk about, there's 2 different types of write-in campaigns that exist, and there's a little bit of confusion between the 2 of them. One of them is kind of a scenario where in the primary election after filing week, suddenly the people realize, usually from the opposing party, that nobody on their side, maybe you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, and nobody on your side filed a candidate as an option for that position. So there's somebody running entirely unopposed. In Washington state law, you can register and run as a write-in candidate for that position, and if you get more than 1% of the vote, then as a write-in candidate, then you're able to actually have your name on the ballot in the general. So that would be a successful write-in in a primary election, means you get more than 1% of the vote, and that allows you to be an official candidate in the general election. So that's the most common type of write-in, successful write-in campaign that you'll see in Washington state. That does happen. The other one is just the classic scenario where somebody jumps in the general election and runs as a write-in candidate and wins the whole thing. So that's less common. But let's talk about a few scenarios in Washington state, recent history, where write-in candidates have actually been able to be successful. One of them was Spokane County Treasurer Rob Chase, and this came from 2010. And what happened is it was a scenario where there was only a Democrat on the ballot running for treasurer, and Rob Chase helped organize and ran a write-in campaign where he got over 2% of the vote in the primary. And that allowed him to be on the ballot for the general election, which he won. He got over 51% of the vote, and he prevailed in Spokane and became Spokane County's treasurer. That was an example of a successful write-in campaign that started from nowhere and ended up basically winning the whole thing. They got on in the primary, they won the general. Rob Chase, interestingly enough, is actually going to be on the ballot in the 4th legislative district outside of Spokane, running for the State House of Representatives. So that started his 2010, this write-in campaign started his political career in Washington state, and he's still involved today. Another more recent example is in 2019 in the city of Camas, where Barry McDonald ran actually as a write-in campaign in the city of Camas, and it really was triggered by this an unopposed incumbent mayor who had supported a very aggressive tax increase for a pool. I wrote in an article about it and did a video about this that was just defeated 9-1. It was just completely destroyed. However, he ran as a write-in campaign in the general election to defeat the mayor. And what was amazing is that he got 51% of the vote and he prevailed. The incumbent mayor was defeated. And what's more significant about that success in his case was he also defeated a number of other write-in candidates who had also kind of flooded the zone. So there were a whole bunch of different write-in candidates for the election, and he managed to win. Now, that's a pretty good example of an environment where a write-in campaign can prevail because the total number of votes in that election were just a little over 7,000 votes. That's not super small, but that's manageable as far as getting the word out and convincing people to vote for you. And that's an example of a successful write-in campaign that was just a year ago, and so it can be done. Another example of a successful primary write-in campaign was the 2012 Washington State Treasurer race, where Sharon Hannick saw that the Republicans didn't put anybody to challenge the incumbent Democrat for a statewide office, and she decided to run a write-in campaign. I remember helping her at the time. And this was actually one of the most successful statewide write-in campaigns that Washington State's ever had. She was able to get 3 times the number of people to vote for her than what she needed, and that easily was able to qualify her for getting on the ballot in the general. She got over 33,000 votes, and it was only in a few weeks' time, so they were able to communicate with enough people around the state to know to write Sharon Hannick's name in, and she was successfully able to get on the ballot. She did not win the general election. She got 41% of the vote, but that was still an impressive example of somebody writing a successful write-in campaign to actually make sure that an incumbent was being challenged by somebody and that they weren't going to run unopposed in the general election. The most famous example in Washington state history, actually, for a write-in campaign that was successful was Congresswoman Linda Smith. And this is from 1994, so the rules were a little different back then. But in 1994, she jumped in with just 3 weeks' notice to as a write-in campaign in the party primary process. So at the time, Washington State still had a party primary process, not the top two jungle primary that they have now. And she was able to, in a crowded field, get 29% of the vote, which allowed her to be the first write-in congressional candidate in state history and actually challenge the incumbent and prevail. She won and became Washington State's Congresswoman in Southwest Washington for several years. And this is well known as one of the more successful write-in campaigns that Washington State's ever had. And Linda Smith is actually well known for this write-in campaign. Now, the rules are different then than they are now. These are just a few examples. There are some more examples that I have of smaller races. The city of Bakota, there's other places around Washington State where there are some successful write-in campaigns that happen, but these are a couple of the highlights, and I think they're worth looking at so you can see examples of success so you know where it's possible. And that being said, write-in campaigns are not optimal. It is a foolish approach to take that as your primary way of running for office. Elections are hard enough as they are just by themselves. It's hard enough to run a race. It's hard enough to be successful even when your name is on the ballot. And it makes it a lot harder, and you're pushing a much bigger boulder up that hill in order to prevail with a write-in campaign. So that being said, everybody, sometimes you're put in positions that you didn't plan or you didn't expect, or your party didn't end up succeeding in getting somebody in the general election. Sometimes everybody wants to be a monkey wrench or have an influence and jump in and make an impact even if it seems like the odds are against you. And this is the role that write-in campaigns sometimes have. So there is a place for them. They are legal, they are difficult, but I think we'll be hearing more about these in Washington State as we move forward. But at least this way you kind of have a better sense of the history and what the options are for write-in campaigns in the future. Thank you for watching. If you know of any write-in candidates or campaigns you think I missed, feel free to add those to the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe and go to wethegovern.com to learn more. And always remember, the future does belong to those who show up.